Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this virtual session of the Lahore Literary Festival with literary luminary Aminata Forna. My name is Tom Owen Edmonds and I have the great joy of moderating today. I was a photographer for 15 years, principally for the BBC, then worked on British government aid in embassies around the world, including 4 extremely happy years living in Lahore from 2011 to 15. Where I was fortunate to attend the first 3 Lahore Literary Festivals. One of the many things I love about the LFF is that it continues rain, shine, or pandemic. So today will be virtual, but you can submit questions for Aminata on the LFF Facebook page. Today we'll be discussing Aminata's latest book, her first collection of essays, The Window Seat, Notes from a Life in Motion. As you'll know, Aminata is author of 4 highly acclaimed novels and a best-selling memoir translated into 22 languages. She's the recipient of a Wyndham Campbell Award from Yale University and has won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and the Ado Snyder Book Prize. She's been the judge of many prestigious literary awards, including the International Man Booker Prize. And she's written and presented several TV documentaries for BBC and CNN. Currently, she is director of the Lannan Center for Poetics and Social Practice at Georgetown University and professor of creative writing at Bath Spa University. But much more important than all of that, she is a very treasured old friend. Aminata, good morning.
Oh, good morning, Tom, or good evening for you, of course. Lovely to see your face.
Good evening from Sydney.
Thank you for that introduction.
I wanted to do you justice. Yes, I've decided to put up the Badshahi Mosque behind. I'm actually in Sydney, but I'm carrying with me happy memories of my time in Lahore.
I've got a pot of flowers. That's the best I could manage at this time of the morning. But anyway, I'm very much looking forward to this. And I've been to the Lahore Literature Festival just once, actually. But I'm trying to remember what year it was. I think it must have been 2017 that I went. Yeah. No, were you there in 2017?
No, we just missed each other. And I remember you were sort of a bit whisked in and whisked out by the British
Council. Because there was some security issue and I was a guest of the British Council and everybody was, the nerves were jangling all over the place. Yeah. And so I was whisked in and whisked out, which is a great shame.
Yeah, well, indeed. Unfortunately, today you're not going to be whisked at all because it's entirely virtual. I want to start by talking about growing up abroad. Your life in motion started at an early age. You were born in Scotland and raised in Sierra Leone, and you've lived for periods in Iran, Thailand, Zambia, and of course, England. At what point did you realize that this was not necessarily the norm?
That's a really good question. I think it took me a very long time to realize. Well, actually, no. I think I'm going to undermine your question. I think that there is a narrative of place. So actually did you grow up abroad?
No, the opposite, completely sedentary.
Okay. So you're one of the people who grew up in one place and then you went to explore the world. Okay. And then but I did it the other way around. I grew up in the world and then tried to, eventually sort of settle-ish somewhere, choose somewhere to settle. But so at what point it took me quite a long time because my parents came from 2 different countries, Sierra Leone and Scotland. Yeah. And then, so I grew up between those places anyway. And I grew up at a time of great political upheaval in Sierra Leone. So we were always having to leave and come and leave and come back, for our own safety. And my father was very politically active. And my parents divorced when I was quite young. And my mother then married a New Zealand diplomat who was a New Zealander, who's actually worked for the United Nations appropriately enough. And that's what took us to various different places, then to Iran and Thailand and Zambia and other countries. In between all of that was, you know, the returns to Sierra Leone, because I was still very much part of my Sierra Leonean family, and then the place where all of these things come together, that wonderful establishment, the British boarding school.
Indeed.
And, you know, I grew up with a lot, I was at school with a lot of girls who lived the same way. Yeah. There were, you know, so it didn't really, and one of them was Pakistan, one of my closest friends, Moni Mosen, you know, last time I saw her at the Lahore Literary Festival. Yeah. So, and then, you know, a Nigerian friends and a very good friend I made who was Thai. So it didn't strike me as particularly unusual. No. I think really until I left school and went to university. But this is where I'm going to take apart your question a bit, because I actually think there's a narrative of place which is stronger than the truth, right? Okay. I think people have always moved. I mean, I'm now in America, a country where people not only moved, you know, 95% of people, I mean, I don't know what the indigenous population is here now, but, you know, basically everybody who came to America was an immigrant. And then the movement within America is huge, huge. People move all the time. Yeah. And yet somehow this narrative of place that we are sort of born to the soil somewhere, you know, that's the narrative we grow up with. And we think everything from that deviates from that is an aberration. But I don't think so at all. You know, I'm often asked, where are my roots? And I say, I don't have roots. I'm not a plant. I have feet.
Yeah, absolutely, which you use. Absolutely. I mean, I wonder whether maybe in Europe people are a bit more sedentary. I mean, I think of some of the people that I grew up with in Hampshire. I think they've been there really quite a long time.
Probably. I think there was a whole
thing, the movement.
Sorry, you cut out for a moment there, Tom. Would you say that again?
Yeah, I wonder if it's a more new world thing, the movement.
Well, you know, there was a survey undertaken that was sponsored by the BBC, and it showed that more than 50% of people consider themselves to be citizens of the world. I mean, I quote it somewhere in my writing, but they see themselves as citizens of the world rather than citizens of a place, of a particular country. But, you know, what you put your finger on is that most of the people who don't see it that way are European. And actually, it's you know, the Asians and Africans very much see themselves as part of the world. I wonder if it's because those people, those of us who you know, occupy those countries, grew up in what seemed to be a very global culture because of the export of TV, film, language, colonialism, of course, you know, which preceded all those things. You know, maybe we just do feel more part of the world than somebody in Hampshire for whom the world has rarely reached them.
No, well, I think that might be right. Amanat, I was keen that you should do a reading at some point because your prose is so beautiful. And you were suggesting reading something from the title essay, The Window Seat. I mean, obviously, one thing that enabled you to travel quite so much when you were growing up was the aeroplane. So I wonder if you could just read for us briefly.
There's a supreme irony in this book coming out now. I mean, there are many tragedies and ironies of the place we find ourselves. But, you know, writing a book called The Window Seat, all about travel and doing everything from within these four walls. But anyway, let's not dwell on that. Let's have some fun. This is the view from the window seat. On an overcast day, the plane breaks through the cloud and into sunlight. As the plane climbs, below you, clouds shift on separate strata. Drifting continents, composed of shadows and light. Sunlight reflects from their dazzling peaks, improbable mountains rise, one the shape perhaps of an anvil or an oak. The occasional sight of another plane reveals the scale of the cloudscape. In it, a jumbo jet is reduced to the size of a child's toy as it seems to skate sideways across the sky, its contrail a disappearing scar. There are times when the plane flies between two strata of cloud. Sometimes a hole in the clouds above lets the sunlight through. The rays, edged in darkness, seem to radiate outward from behind the clouds and illuminate spectacularly, not the earth, but the clouds below. We call this godlight. To overfly the Sahara by day at 30,000 feet is to feel how it might be to circumnavigate the sun. Nothing save raw light in colours from deep orange to pale yellow, very occasionally fractured by imprecise dark and jagged streaks, which one supposes to be riverbeds or rock formations. Otherwise, there is but the brightness of the sand, reflecting the sun's rays, and, depending on the exact altitude and tilt of the aircraft, the line where the orange glow of the ground beneath diffuses into the white band of the horizon, which in turn diffuses into blue sky. To overfly the Sahara by night must be what space travel feels like. Gone are the indicators of life, the lights of civilization one sees flying out over what one supposes to be the most barren of lands. Even there, in some crease in the earth, inevitably, a winking light or a lone road leading from where to where it is impossible to know. The Sahara at night is blackness, unmarred by a single star. You cannot tell where the land and sky meet. Only there is this, beyond the reach of the wingtip, a keen-edged moon. The last time I took a daytime flight over the Sahara was a few years ago on a return trip from Johannesburg. The moment we took off, the cabin staff toured the cabin and lowered the blinds. People found their headsets and turned on the screens in front of them. Light flared around the edges of the blinds, and once, when I dared to raise mine over the Sahara, the light leapt in like a living creature. When I fly, I think of what a caveman would think if he saw this, or even knew that one day somebody would. I think of the generations in the not so distant past who never saw such a view. I think of those in the future who never will see that wonder which our generation's wantonness with the world's natural resources has made possible. The day will come when we will be nostalgic about flying. As incredible as that once seemed, the experience of having our travel curtailed by the pandemic of 2020 brought that feeling closer to many of us. One day this may be gone, sooner than we allowed ourselves to imagine. Only in flight does one become aware of how much of the world has resisted humankind. The snow-filled corrugations of the mountain ranges of Central Europe, where it is impossible to know where one country ends and another begins. At such times, even the flight map, which traces the path of the plane on the screen in front of you, is as effective as pin the tail on the donkey. A ruffle of mountains falls, a new one rises. Once I imagined we must be flying over the Alps, though I think now it was the Massif Central, because a short time later, I looked down and saw the real Alps. I was entirely unprepared for their scale. They seemed to stretch upwards, reaching not so much for the sky, but as if to swap the plane out of it. I have skied the Alps, and I remember being awed by their beauty, but I could see only what filled the frame of my vision, which I realized once I was flying over all 1,200 kilometers of them, lying across 8 countries, wasn't very much at all. To fly over England, indeed much of Northern Europe, is to see a land given over almost entirely to human use. Field abuts field, the evidence of human industry. Before views like that, man appears more ant than ape. For a long time, I wondered at the circles that appeared across the American landscape, in different hues and shades from earth to green. Sometimes they appear in ones and twos within an otherwise empty landscape. Other times they arrive in their dozens in different sizes, overlapping each other like a Kandinsky painting. Other times still, you see them arranged in rows with architectural precision. They remind me of the crop circles that appear every year in fields in England, and which many believe are the result of paranormal activity, and others take to be the work of talented pranksters. The American circles are created by center pivot irrigation systems. I discovered when I eventually got around to looking it up. I regretted the sense of intellectual obligation that had propelled me towards this discovery. I liked, I realized, not knowing, gazing at them anew every time. I was interested, though, to see from photographs how the circles, so mystical from the air, were indiscernible on the ground. Probably if you have flown across borders very much at all, you will have flown over a war. I know I have. Consider the matter. People are killing and being killed and living in terror of being killed, while at a point precisely overhead, you were doing what? You were watching the drinks trolley edge down the aisle, handling the frustrations of plastic cutlery and those fiddly salt and pepper packets, selecting the next movie, whether it should be a thriller, a drama, a love, or a war story. It's likely commercial flights to the country have already stopped. The airport is closed or under the control of one faction or another. The borders will be tightly controlled too. Imagine a person looking up and seeing an aeroplane in the sky. The freedom the passing plane must surely represent. It must be like standing on a desert island, watching the ships pass by, without the possibility even of being able to lift a hand and wave, or to shout and be heard.
Thank you, Aminata. Thank you. It's so beautiful to hear you read it, and it's so lovely for us to have an opportunity just to hear some of your prose. Thank you.
You know, it takes me back to your last question about, we were talking about place. Oh, yeah. Actually, my American editors asked me to put in, there's a sentence that says, I had written, if you fly very much at all.
Yeah.
You've flown very much at all. And they said, can you put in across borders? And I said, well, it's implicit. And they said, well, actually, Americans fly all the time, but they don't cross borders very much. And so in the end, I conceded. I mean, we're always having this sort of little tug of war between your audiences, you know, because I mean, to me, I write for a global audience, and if you can't figure out that I mean across borders, then that's, but if they came back to me several times saying, you know, a lot of our American readership is going to be confused by this sentence. Can you add in across borders?
I mean, I'm so struck in that piece by the sort of counterpoint of the very lyrical and the very mundane, and then you bring in the, you know, the conflicts below, which has occurred to me on flights. And in your essay, Iran 1979, you don't fly over that conflict, and you land.
That's right, that's right. I lived in Iran for one very important year of Iran's life, which was also a very important year of my life, which was the late 1978 to late 1979, you know, for the period of the revolution. There, my stepfather, as I said, was with the United Nations, and you know, he specialized in conflict zones, as people who work for the UN often do. So in fact, actually, he had been posted to Afghanistan, and all our worldly goods had left to be shipped to Afghanistan. And then the situation in Afghanistan became sufficiently untenable that he was diverted to Iran. Because, you know, those people who prophesied these things could see that they might require a man like my stepfather there at that time. And so we went to Iran. I mean, it didn't last very long, to be honest. I mean, you know, by the end of 1979, my parents had shipped out again. It was just a year, but a year that you know, had a profound impact, I think, not just on, you know, not just to be a young girl, you know, personally at a time going through a country where women's rights were in retrograde, but also to see how mutable political situations are, you know, how changeable, how volatile, and how different actors can shape them at different times. And I learned a lot. It took me many, many years, Tom, to sort of figure out what exactly I had learned from the time in Iran. But, you know, once I put it together with all the other places that I had lived or been and you know, and political situations I'd witnessed, it began to make increasing amounts of sense.
You write about you know, what's known as the boiling of the frog. That with each that when the revolution happened, there was a tremendous excitement, outpouring of joy. Everybody was ecstatic, and then slowly, you know, domino by domino, it just began to come apart. I mean, that's something very fascinating to see that firsthand in Iran, but it's something we see, you know, all over the world as well. Was it, as you were saying, only obvious later, and you were only 14 or 15, but there must have been an element where even at the time, I mean, one, you knew you were living through history, and two, you could see these changes sweeping through with all roadblocks and everything else.
To me, it was not obvious at the time. I mean, you know, I couldn't foresee anything. I was excited as everybody else. I mean, I was kind of torn because, you know, the Shah had a reputation for progressiveness, and so, you know, I was in that sense, I was torn. But, you know, I didn't believe in the idea of eternal monarchies. So, but that first spring of 1979, when everybody was so happy, you know, and the seasons were moving along with us, you know, we'd gone through this awful winter, and there was, you know, oil strikes, and we had been freezing in our house, and Iran has very heavy snowfall, and then, well, Tehran does, and then, you know, of course, I was going to and from my British boarding school at this time, so, you know, I go back to boarding school, where, you know, and one of the things I write about is that overseas girls are allowed to watch the news when it's their country falling apart. So you get called down to the house mistress.
You must have watched a lot of news.
I did. Yes, I was sort of nominally allowed to join the Iranian girls. I mean, you know, I sort of think what must it have felt like for them. And of course, I then had that experience myself when Sierra Leone went to war. And, you know, I was watching it in, you know, through the 90s to, you know, I was watching my country implode on television. So, and that's an eerie experience, but that's another conversation. So I remember the Shah leaving, and then I went back that spring, and it was a different country. You know, it looked different, it felt different, but all the exiles had returned. You know, people were having parties and gatherings and lunches, and it felt completely different. And then, of course, I would step away, off I'd go back to, you know, prep and dormitories, and then come back again. And then by June, July, everything is being reshaped, and the comité are on the streets, and you know, the parties are over, and women are being told to wear the veil, and life is becoming, you know,
just slowly being strangled. I love the way you describe the sort of the everyday life that goes on against this monumental background, and the sort of small risks you take for the small pleasures. You talk about people in Sarajevo dodging Sniper Alley to get a cup of coffee, and you have a wonderful description of dodging the roadblocks in order to get to a New Year's Eve party.
Yes, I mean, I've done it quite a few times. Well, you must have lived through a lot of curfews as well, Tom. You know, and there's a point where the human spirit will not be repressed.
Completely.
And, you know, I mean, there was the curfew party in Tehran, which was, well, I used to go to curfew parties of various kinds. When I was a teenager, our curfew parties were, you got there at 8, you got there just before curfew started, and then you stayed all night, right? And you left at 8 o'clock in the morning.
You
know, we used to have we called them pajama parties.
But so, I mean, I spent quite a lot of time in the mid-80s in Chile under Pinochet. and there you'd have a toke, a curfew, and you'd have toke to toke parties. So you'd arrive.
Right, that's exactly.
And we had one rather memorable failure where the time of the curfew was brought forward 2 hours. So we were sitting at home with they have very good oysters in Chile, and we had, I think, 200 oysters and no guests.
Oh, you didn't try to eat them all, did you?
We made quite a good stab at it.
Have you ever looked an oyster in the eye again? Well, and then the other one, which is the one I went to in Iran, is that you sort of feign nighttime. And so the party started at whatever, 1 in the afternoon, and everybody turned up in evening dress. And the curtains were tightly closed so that not a ray of sunshine penetrated. And then but this is the more difficult kind, I think, because you know, what then happens is, as curfew approaches, and everyone by this time has had a bit to drink, you know, even there was some contraband liquor around. Everyone's had a bit to drink, but certainly everybody is socializing and enjoying themselves. And then suddenly, oh my God, we've got to get back. You know?
Yeah. It's just, that's not.
I mean, in Sierra Leone, I was at the end of the war. You know, going to our favorite bars and getting back for. So, you know, I remember, you know, friends of ours saying, no, you go, you'd better go, you're not going to make it back in time. And I said, what are you doing? And they said, oh, well, the soldiers on the barricades know us. But, you know, it only takes a change of guard. And,
absolutely.
And, you know, and these, of course, so it's interesting, you know, in the times of COVID, where there have been various curfews. Yep. So, you know, I was saying to people here in America, so what happens if you break curfew? And they were going, oh, well, you get fined. They said, you get fined. And I said, oh, is that all? They said, well, what? And I said, everywhere else I've lived, if you broke curfew, you got shot. You get fined.
They've got a lot to learn about a curfew.
But, you know, all the time we've been going through this, Tom. I mean, you've been in Australia, which is a little bit better, but all the time we've been going through this, and you know, there's been this sort of tug between you know, the extremely cautious and people. You know, you know, working alongside all of the wonderful scientists that we had, they really needed psychologists, right?
True. Yeah.
To say this is how a population behaves. This is the point at which people will begin to defy things, and you sort of need to factor that in. And I think, you know, I mean, it's all very well laughing and joking about risking being shot to, you know, to have a drink in a bar, but that, you know, that is what people do. People want to live, and life is irrepressible, and we really have to take that into account.
Yeah, that is so true. That's so true. I mean, before we get on to some more sort of serious stuff, I just want to talk briefly about family. I mean, given that you did move so much and you spent so much of your time at boarding school, I've got a sense that maybe a bit like me, you've built to an extent your own family, that one's friends at school have a much closer and more familial relationship than they would do otherwise, especially especially when you're a long way away from home and you're having to draw together under difficult circumstances. And I also wanted to ask about, sorry, I'm stacking up 2 questions at once, about extended families, because I loved your essay, Santigi, and the blurring that you get in Africa and Asia between what is family and what is not family. I mean, the people who live in your house, they might be cousins, they may be no relation at all, they might technically be staff, but you have a very familial relationship with them. So I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about Santigi. I just think that's such a touching story.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I mean, Santigi was, for want of a better word, a retainer that I grew up with. And it took me a while to sort of, you know, figure out exactly who he was in the family. And it turned out that he'd been with my stepmother forever. You know, she had grown up with him, taking care of her. And as she grew up and became a young woman and went to Britain on a scholarship and came back and married first my father and then my stepfather, he always went with them. Whichever household. When my father was imprisoned, Santigi looked after, we went into exile in Britain, and during the period when my father was a political prisoner, and the person who looked after our house and the dogs and, who kept everything going in Sierra Leone was Santigi. And then when we went, and he was the first person my father saw when he was released from prison. And, one of the first people I saw when I went back home after that period. Right up until a couple of years ago, Santigi was always there. So I knew him from when I guess he would have been in his late teens. No, actually, that's wrong. He must have been in his mid-20s. The trouble was that he always fibbed about his age. Said he was younger than he was. So everyone was a bit confused. But if I think about how old my stepmother was, knowing that he was a few years older than her, because she remembered him from when she was a child, he must have been when I first knew him in his mid-20s. And I knew him all the way till I guess he was in his early 70s when he eventually died. And even when things were very difficult for my family and we couldn't look after him, couldn't pay him, and he would always come and help out, come and help on the weekends and things like that. He was a wonderful man. Here's an interesting thing again. My first novel was called Ancestor Stones, and it was set in a big polygamous family, very much like my grandfather's family. My grandfather had 16 wives, not all at once, I must, but he had a very long life for a start, and he had many wives. And of course, very sadly, the maternal mortality rate in Sierra Leone is extremely high. So, a lot of these women didn't really make it past, like my own grandmother didn't survive childbirth. So, but anyway, at any one time, he always had a pretty well-populated family. And, when I wrote this book, I remember really distinctly how the Asians and the Africans had no trouble at all with family relationships, right? No trouble with all the names and and the Europeans and Americans just couldn't get their head around it. And again, with the window seat, when I refer to my brother, and I'm talking about my half-brother, my American editors are saying, well, shouldn't you put half in or step in? They want steps and the halves, and I'm just like, it's just my brother and it's just my mother, right?
It is that. I mean, even in many Asian African languages, there are different words for elder brother and younger brother. There are different words for maternal aunt and maternal aunt, paternal aunt and maternal aunt, and it just shows that family is incredibly important, is a very ever-present force, isn't it?
I was talking to Isabel Allende, talking about Chilean writers. So I was talking to Isabel Allende, and she, and actually the thing that we were discussing was the fact that when I was growing up in Sierra Leone, many of the books I was reading were the South American writers, particularly Isabel Allende as a young woman. And the reason was that she was writing about the things that were taking place in our country, but that our writers hadn't yet begun to write about. I mean, for many reasons, including censorship, but these things had happened. These imploding states had already happened in South America. So, House of the Spirits meant a great deal to me because it resonated so much with the world that I inhabited. And she said that she was often asked by Americans why family, why there was family was so much a part of her storytelling. And she said the reason was this, because if you live in unstable countries, your support system is your family. That's the only thing you can depend on, right? So family matters. Whereas in countries which are more politically stable, or where you have a welfare state or whatever, you can step away from your family or maybe you can choose different family if you want to. in a way that you can't. So that brings us back to Santigi. Santigi chose us because Santigi didn't know where he came from. I mean, which always struck me as almost unbelievable in a country where everybody knows everything about everybody else. Santigi was a genuine orphan, as far as we know. He'd been born to a single mother. She had gone to work in the diamond fields and given him, which is of course also very typical, she gave him to her neighbors to care for while she went to earn some money, and she never came back. That's not an unusual story. The mortality rates in the mining areas are very high. And so the family raised him as their own, and and eventually she went to work with my stepmother's grandmother. He went to work with my stepmother's grandmother, and that's where my stepmother first encountered him. So, he knew that he was a Limba because he could speak the language.
Right, and
that's all he knew about himself.
Yeah. But I mean, I want to move on in a tick, but I just found it so moving that at the beginning, he was very much supporting you, and he was the one, well, sorry, I suppose when it ebbs and flows, at the beginning you were supporting him, then when you were out of the country, he was the one who went to visit your father every week and take him food and was the first one to greet him when he came out of prison. And then later in life, when he fell on hard times, and Tiggy fell on hard times, you supported him, and you're exactly right. It's a sort of, it's the Asian and African sort of social support network.
Yeah.
I have a theory, Aminata, he died of a broken heart. I think you said he took up drinking when your father was executed.
Yes, that's right. I think he died of a broken heart. I mean, he was just never the same again. And he had a love for my father that was just unparalleled, except by my father's own children. But, after both, there was a cousin called Molai and Santigi. They lived with us in those years when the government were persecuting my father. And both of them, after my father's death, and the country went into a very sharp decline and turned into a dictatorship, both of them turned to alcohol. Yeah. And Molai managed to pull himself out of it, and now is he's a successful man. He's put all his kids through university. He runs a school that I helped found with him and with the village in Sierra Leone. Actually, again, a lot with our help. So we've all helped each other. He helped us, start the school. The school's in the village. Generations are going to it with some sort of blood connection with me, probably. But Santigi never ever recovered. He drank and he drank and he drank, and it was a strange thing because in every way he remained the decent, honest, caring person that he always was. But my mother had to lock the drinks cabinet when they went out because he would just sort of hit the bottle. And I think he did die of a broken heart. He never he never recovered from it.
No. Aminata, can we talk about colonialism? You write about it a lot, and it's obviously the backdrop to your upbringing. I mean, really the transition from the colonial era to independence. And in Obama and the Renaissance generation, you talk about your father and Obama's father being the generation who were taken abroad to be educated with the idea that they should come back and lead their new nations.
Yes, and Wole Soyinka called them the Renaissance generation, which is a wonderful phrase because, and again, the further I get away from that generation, they're dying now. The more remarkable I think they were because they, Rushdie writes Midnight's Children about being born on the night of is it partition or independence?
Yeah, a partition.
Partition.
And independence.
Independence. These were men and women who were born 20 years before. So they came of age at the same time as their countries. So, you know, they grew into this, and it resonated and had great meaning for them. They'd fought for independence. And by the time they got it, they were completely poised to be the ones to lead the country. And I mean in the broadest sense or the narrowest sense, you know, but they were going to be the engineers, the doctors, the lawyers. It was their generation's task. And they really rose to the occasion, and getting a Western education, which was my father's obsession. You know, I couldn't understand what it was with British boarding schools. But you know, I see now that what he wanted was for us to become world people, to be completely competent in the world. And in that sense, he was completely successful. You know, I have no trouble going anywhere and speaking to anybody, you know, from Hampshire to Honolulu. I have no trouble communicating with people across the world. So, you know, my father and Obama's father, slightly different trajectories, because Kenya, the British were so angry with the Kenyans for the rebellion of the Mau Mau, that they were refusing to accord them the same support that they were according the West African and the Asian countries, of giving out scholarships and extending those educational opportunities to Kenyans. So in fact, it was the Americans who saw an opportunity when a young Kenyan activist called Tom Mboya started touring America, trying to raise money for scholarships for Kenyans to go to American universities. Kennedy was one of the people who stepped up, but you know, the Americans saw their opportunity to establish relationship with the Kenyan country, so with the African country. So, and actually, if you look at the trajectory of the scholarships, you know, first of all, it was the old colonial countries. So if you were you know, if you were in the Congo, you went to Belgium. If you were, you know, in Mali, you went to France. If you were in Sierra Leone or Nigeria or Ghana, you went to Britain. And then gradually the Eastern Europeans start to get in on the act. And so, you know, if you look at Sierra Leonean society, because we're such a sort of little tiny society, you know, the people of mixed heritage my age, it's all British and Sierra Leonean, and then the next lot are Russian and Sierra Leonean and Ukrainian and Sierra Leonean, and then the next lot, the ones who are in their 20s now, are Chinese and Sierra Leonean. As people went to those countries, and you would be away from home. My father was away from home for 10 years, you know, so, and 10 years, you know, at a particular point in a young man's life where you're going to meet a woman and settle down, probably. So, that's what happened in both my father's case and Obama Sr.'s case. Well, Obama Sr. didn't exactly settle down, but he did have it. He did produce an American president.
I think that's an achievement.
But man, that takes us, sorry, Tom, but that takes us right back to that narrative of place. You know, in that essay, I quote one of Obama's biographers saying, nobody's life could be the product of such randomness as Barack Obama. And actually, his life is not the product of randomness. It is the product of hundreds of years of British foreign policy.
No, indeed. Aminata, you have a fantastic description of your, I think is your mother's description of your father on Sierra Leonean Independence Day, chain smoking on the top of a bus, I think.
All at once, not even chain, like 7 or 8 cigarettes all at once. He didn't actually smoke.
And she asked him why, and he says, I'm smoking the smoke of freedom. Fabulous idea. But you then say, and I suppose, unfortunately, in Sierra Leone's case, that a lot of this Renaissance generation were actually set up to fail.
I think so, and I think, you know, the mid-range lens of history tells us that. You know, it can't have been a surprise to anybody in the British government that these countries were not prepared. They had been denied everything, and one of the reasons that the young men and women had to go overseas to study was because Britain you know, having been unnerved by the Indian independence movement, deliberately denied any kind of higher educational opportunities to those countries. Yeah. So, you know, Sierra Leone had a university, but it was more like a sort of technical college. You know, you could get some qualifications to do a certain kind of low-skilled occupation that would sort of support the colonial government, but you couldn't ever get an education that would give you the sort of intellectual tools to challenge it. So number one, they had done that. They denied an education to millions of people. And number two, and don't forget, these were backward steps, because some of these things existed in Sierra Leone before colonialism. So these were retrograde steps. But number two also, you know, for all the sort of magnanimity that Britain claims to have bestowed democracy, they did not rule democratically. They ruled by decree. So, and again, a retrograde step, because actually Sierra Leone at the village level or the chieftaincy level had a form of democracy. Actually still does, right? That did survive, but still does, where decisions have to be taken collectively. But at the macro level, but at the state level, Britain ruled by decree. So, you know, what do they think is going to happen? So I think there was a lot of faux naivety on the part of the exiting colonial powers. I think they knew perfectly well that it was going to be very hard for these countries to survive. And we now know it through all the nation building exercises that, you know, we have continued to take part in different parts of the globe.
It's quite a counterpart, the sort of the end of colonialism with scholarships in Scotland and new national anthems and handshakes to the beginning of it. Which was all, especially in West Africa, rooted in slavery. You write about your visit to Bunce Island to see one of the old slave forts, which reminded me of when I was in Ghana. I went to one of the slave forts there and found it was completely intact in every way. I think they even still have some of the chains.
Elmina, is it?
That's it, absolutely, Elmina. And it was interesting. There was a group. There were sort of three separate lots in the group. There was one the white Europeans, and you know, we were all very, very, very shocked and shaken by it. Then there was some black African Americans who were, you know, distraught, totally understandably, absolutely distraught. And then there was a third sort of group who were local Ghanaians, whose reaction wasn't so strong, and there was more of a visiting a local landmark than anything deeper than that, and that really, really struck me.
Well, I'm often asked what the West African response to slavery is. My answer is going to be a little bit complicated. In Sierra Leone and across West Africa, of course, the Creoles are the returned descendants of the enslaved people, and have on the whole done very well for themselves. You know, speaking English, arriving, and in Liberia too, of course, the American Liberians. So, you know, being able to speak English, often being literate, they were in an advantageous position towards the end of actually under colonialism. So the Creoles in Sierra Leone actually became the bureaucrats for the British. So that, you know, that creates a certain kind of friction, right? But also you must remember that slavery existed within Africa as well as outside. So one of the things I write about is my grandfather, and my grandfather was a chief. He became a regent chief. My great-grandfather had been a king, an obai, and his daughter was given as a slave to a warrior. I mean, what we'd now call a sort of warlord, I suppose. But you know, he was the man was basically a mercenary who was fighting on behalf of what another king. And in the peace settlement, he was given a number of slaves, among whom were the king's daughter. Now, you know, slavery was a very different. Now, this begins to kind of irritate people when you say, well, slavery was different in West Africa, but it was different, right? Number one, it didn't rest on the color of your skin. Number two, you couldn't be born a slave, right? You were not born a slave, right? So she was given in order to create a treaty, a peace treaty, right?
Yes.
And so she, you know, rather like the kings and queens of Europe did once upon a time. So she married him and she had children, and she eventually went back to, I mean, I can't tell you the whole story because it would take too long, but she eventually wins a way to find her freedom. And she is freed by, and this is another significant difference, she is freed by her brothers, who by this time are the king and his, you know, I don't know, his sidekick. And there was a formal way of freeing people. You offered certain goods, and the person who was the theoretical slave owner had to release them. So, you know, it was a different form of enslavement. And then she goes back to being a princess again. And the same thing happens to my grandfather. You know, for a period, he was sold into bondage in order to raise money. So I think that the full understanding of what transatlantic slavery meant to West Africans is not, the full import of it is not there. But the other thing that one should bear in mind is that for Sierra Leoneans, for example, you know, and I've had this conversation in America quite a few times when people, when African Americans have derided Sierra Leoneans for insufficient, I suppose, sympathy. Is, you know, I say, well, you know, colonialism was slavery, right? I mean, there was an article recently about how the height of the average African shrunk decreased under slavery, under colonialism, because of forced labor. So colonialism was slavery, but then what do we get after colonialism? We then get 25 years of dictatorship, followed by 10 years of a civil war. So, you know, I mean, I think for a lot of people growing up in African countries, it's like slavery was terrible, but it feels very, very, very far away compared to the present issues.
Yeah. How there's just so fascinating, isn't those different perspectives? I mean, actually, I want to talk about one more thing. We've been given a few extra minutes for good behaviour. I've just seen in the chat. Again, if it's okay with you, we've been allowed to overrun by a couple of minutes, because I was really, really struck on the subject of different perspectives by the conversation you had with some Malian colleagues who were extremely sure that Obama was a white president.
Of course, and he would be in Sierra Leone, he would be considered white too. And it was so funny that, you know, my white colleagues just could not figure this out. Yeah. I mean, I'm mixed. I am half, well, you know, half, but you know, I'm mixed black and white. And in Sierra Leone, I'm very often described as a Westerner, or, I mean, they probably now kind of say, you know, people are more au fait with mix, they might call me mulatto, is a word I dislike, but you know, they might say that. But what they see is the whiteness. Yes, and in white countries, what people see is the blackness. So when people look at Obama, they see the whiteness. He looks very pale to them. You know, and my stepmother said it very well, described it very well to me once. I said to her, you know, I said, I understand that they see the whiteness. I said, but I don't look like, for example, my husband, who is, you know, your color, right? And so I said, you know, I'm trying to understand this perspective. What is it they see? I see that they see the whiteness, but can they not see the difference? Yeah. And she said, well, they think of you just like another kind of white person, the way one might look at a Norwegian and an Italian. right? It's another kind of white person. And that's a perfect example, because that's how white people see black people, you know, another kind. So coming to America, I mean, the lens that shifted everything for me was coming to America, where people who looked to me white, right, were described as African-American. And I was thinking, how would you even know? Yeah. And even if you could see that they are not purely of European origin, how would you know what the brownness was, right? It could be Native American, it could be, I mean, it could be anything.
I mean, the whole not one drop thing, I mean, does that make any sense at all?
None at all. Do you remember Ugly Betty? Do you remember that series, Ugly Betty? And I remember as a white Kenyan friend of mine ringing me up, you know, almost at the end of, you know, I don't know, you know, series number 5 or whatever it was, there were so many of them, and having only just clicked, as I did, that the boss, the woman boss, was supposed to be black. Right. And it was Vanessa Williams. And I was like, I watched this whole thing, never once clicking that this woman was supposed to be a woman of color. Right. She just looked like a tanned European to me. Yeah. And so, you know, I mean, I don't know, it's very odd in America, and they really hold on to this. Now, I can see that culturally you could be African-American, and I suppose what you have to do is you have to look at, this is such a segregated society, that you'll grow up culturally African-American, however pale your skin is.
Okay. Yes. So that, I mean, that I can understand, and that makes absolute sense. I mean, is there any sense, Reni Edo-Khan refers to race as a social construct, but you know, they said there's no scientific difference at all. And I mean, given the fact that, I mean, you're half white, half black, in Africa, you're thought of as white, in America, you're thought of as black. Is there any latitude for you to make that decision, Aminata, for you to say, I'm either black, white, or I'm something else?
I do. No, I mean, you know, this identity is a two-way street, right? Isn't it? You know, I'm a woman. I will be treated as a woman wherever I go, but I define how I live my life, and I define how I describe myself, and what I do or do not subscribe to, and the same with heritage. You know, it's taken a long time for me, but I insist that I am described in newspapers, if I'm interviewed or something, as Sierra Leonean and Scottish, right? Not slash, not hyphen, or you can say Scottish and Sierra Leonean, right? But it's and, you know, one doesn't mutually exclude the other. And, you know, this has taken ages, and I'm not as young as I was, but I now see that newspapers, that the media is beginning to understand better how to describe people. You know, first of all, what used to happen to me in Britain was that my British part of my heritage was completely airbrushed out. I was described as a Sierra Leonean author. And I think I live in Britain. I was born in Scotland. Half my family live in Scotland, but no, it's too complicated to have both, you know. And then, I've only ever once been described as a Scottish author, but that was by a Canadian newspaper. But more recently, I was made a global Scot by the Scottish, the Scottish office of the embassy in Washington, DC, as you know, Scotland's trying to rebrand itself. So you know, I think that the battle for complexity is being won. I think it is being won, but slowly. But just by perseverance and insistence. Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
Can I read this essay about perspective, which I think...
Yeah, please, Aminata, absolutely.
It'll only take about 45 minutes or an hour. No, it's a wee essay. It's the shortest in the book, but it's one of my favourite.
Yeah.
In Timbuktu, because we were talking about Mali, weren't we? In Timbuktu. In Timbuktu, I stopped a man to ask him the way to the post office. The man had a question of his own that he wanted answered first. Is it true, he said, that in Britain people have a thing about Timbuktu? Yes, I said. People think it's far away, like the farthest place on earth. At this, the man laughed for a long time. then he gave me directions to the post office.
Absolutely. That's so brilliant. That's so brilliant.
I always remember in Timbuktu, you know, they thought that Obama was white, and they thought Timbuktu was the center of the earth. And Timbuktu, it was the center of the earth, of course, for a long time. It's, you know, it was this massive trading place. And so, you know, what you see is depends on where you're standing.
That's so true. That's so true. Amanata, we have reached the hour. That has been, absolute joy to speak to you. Thank you.
Talking to you. When are we going to see you here in the States?
Oh, well, goodness knows, at current rate of inoculation in Australia, but as soon as possible, for sure. For sure. It'd be lovely to end on that note in Timbuktu. Something light, something joyous to carry us forward. Stay safe, stay happy. It's beautiful to see you, and thank you so much for letting us all perch alongside you today on your window seat in the ether.
Thank you very much. Thank you for taking the middle seat.
Always.
Take care, Tom.
Yeah, you too. Lovely to see you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.